Hi Year 3! I am about to read the final chapter of Oliver and the Seawicks. I am so excited to find out what happens. We have all absolutely loved reading this story to you, and we really hope you've enjoyed listening along and enjoyed the story just as much as we have. But now it's time to find out how it ends. Here we go.
Mr. and Mrs. Crisp were very meek during the journey home. They knew that their terrible adventures had all happened because they'd been so eager to explore the islands, and they knew of the dangers that Oliver had braved to rescue them. No more exploring for us, they agreed, sitting with Oliver, Iris and Mr. Culpepper beside the campfire that they had lit on Cliff's Head. But Oliver knew they didn't mean it. After all the thrilling new things they'd seen, they would soon be itching to go exploring again. They wouldn't even have to worry about money anymore because the old trunks which they'd dragged out of the watermole to use as seats around the fire turned out to be stuffed full of Spanish gold. For the moment, though, they seemed very happy to be safe and back with Oliver again, and they were happier still a few days later when Cliff waded into Deepwater Bay and they saw their house and the dear old Explorermobile standing where they had left them. Oliver wasn't happy, though. He was glad to see dry land again, but he didn't feel that surge of joy he'd felt when Mum drove them down the lane to the house that first day. He still wanted a home just as badly, but he wanted something else now too. He wanted to be with Cliff and Iris. He was going to miss them. He would even miss crotchety Mr. Culpepper. So he stood quietly watching while the shore came closer and his mum and dad did a happy to be home dance on Cliff's golden sand. And when they said, "Look, Ollie, it's our house," and "Aren't you glad to be back?" he nodded and said that he was. But Mr. and Mrs. Crisp could tell he wasn't, and they both looked solemnly at one another. They both knew how sweet and sad it can be to want two different things so completely. "Don't worry," said Mr. Crisp, putting an arm round Oliver's shoulders. "We'll find a way." Mrs. Crisp knelt down and tapped politely on Cliff's forehead. "We were wondering," she said, "if you've nowhere else to go, perhaps you'd like to stay here in Deepwater Bay. It looks so much nicer with an island in it." So Cliff found a comfortable spot for himself just offshore, and that night the Crisp family slept in actual beds inside a proper house for the first time in years. Iris made up a bed for herself in the bath. Early the next morning, Oliver took the dinghy up the coast to Farsight Cove with Iris swimming alongside. The beach optician was in his usual spot on the sand, and he looked very startled when Iris came out of the sea. He had never really believed in mermaids either, and his beach optician's stall was just an excuse to get away from his noisy family and spend a few hours each day sitting quietly by the sea. But he hid his surprise as best he could and tested Iris's eyes and presented her with a very fetching pair of spectacles. "Wow," she said, gazing about her at the cliffs, the sand, the sea. Suddenly everything looked very sharp and clear. She wasn't sure she liked it, though she supposed she would get used to it in time. "So that's what you look like," she said, peering at Oliver through the thick lenses. "Oh." "What do you mean, oh?" asked Oliver. "Nothing," said Iris. Meanwhile, Mr. Crisp had been drawing plans on the backs of old envelopes, and Mrs. Crisp had been telephoning local builders and asking if they would accept payment in ancient Spanish doubloons. It turned out that they would, and soon the Crisps' old house had been dismantled and rebuilt on top of Cliff. "It's the best wig a rambling isle ever had," he said, delightedly, when it was finished. Of course, that meant that there was no longer room for the watermole, but the old submarine wasn't really suited to being out in the open air anyway, and its timbers were beginning to crumble as they dried out. So they carefully lowered it to the bottom of Deepwater Bay, and Iris set up house inside it. When Oliver came home from school in the afternoons, he'd often dive down to visit her, holding his breath for as long as he could to see her latest improvements. Now that she could see clearly, Iris had grown rather house-proud, and she had gathered odds and ends from the seabed to decorate her new home. Oliver thought the old toilet bowl she had on display in the centre of her kitchen table looked rather odd, but she'd arranged such a colourful collection of live sea anemones in it that he had to confess it brightened up the place. She'd also hung up several mirrors, which Oliver noticed were all cracked, but he was too polite to ask if she'd been singing. The more she showed him, the faster he'd nod and approve it all, as his cheeks went redder and redder from the lack of air. But Iris was always pleased to see him making the effort. Here it is. Doesn't it look cool? And Oliver holding his breath. Even Mr. Culpepper stayed. He complained that the island was getting very built up, and he enjoyed telling other visiting birds that he could remember when it was all just rocks and grass. But he built himself a large raggedy nest on the roof just above Oliver's bedroom, and enjoyed waking Oliver up each morning by leaning down and shouting, "Time for school!" through the window. Oliver didn't mind though. He enjoyed school. Mr. and Mrs. Crisp have made a little bridge to link Cliff to the mainland, wide enough for the Explorermobile or the cars of visiting friends to drive across. But it isn't a permanent bridge. It can be folded back onto Cliff's shores whenever the Crisps want to remember that they really do live on an island. And sometimes, in Oliver's school holidays, or on other days when they just feel like it, they say to Cliff, "This feels like an exploring day." Then they fold the bridge away and Cliff wades off in search of strange seas and forgotten coves, with Mr. and Mrs. Crisp safe and snug in their own living room, Mr. Culpepper keeping watch from his nest, and Iris and Oliver riding on the beach. It is by far the most comfortable way to go exploring. And that is the end of the story. There's Oliver sitting there, and there's his house on top of Cliff.
Oh, I do love a happy ending. What a great way to finish the story. Really hope you enjoyed it. For your curriculum board for week 5, we are going to include some activities about Oliver and the Seawigs. So we would like you to have a go at designing your own front cover of the story. So think really carefully about all the main events of the story and how you could show that in one picture for the front cover, so that somebody picking up the book would think, "Oh, that looks like an exciting book to read. I'd like to have a go at that." And we'd also like you to have a little think of any questions you'd like to ask Oliver. So as we've been reading, is there anything that you think, "Oh, I'd love to know how Oliver felt about that," or "I'd love to know what Oliver would do in this situation"? So have a little think, and we can't wait to see what you come up with.